Warm welcome to everyone who's joined us this morning. Colleagues from the Probation Service, from other parts of HMPPS, from academia, from the trade unions, and from a range of other organisations, and you are all very welcome. This is a launch event for our report on race equality in probation, published yesterday. It's actually the last thematic report that will be published during my time as Chief Inspector, and it's a very important one. Race equality has been a big priority for me during my 4 years as Chief Inspector, and this is our third thematic inspection on this topic since I've become Chief. We've also significantly increased our focus on race and on other diversity aspects in our core inspections, and we're striving to be a diverse organisation ourselves. So I'm delighted to be launching this report today. Next slide, please, Holly. Very quick run through of what you're going to be hearing today. We have blocked out an hour and a half for today's launch event. We're expecting the presentations to take up roughly an hour, and then there'll be plenty of time to ask follow-up questions as well. To start off with, you'll be hearing a little bit from me about a previous thematic that we did on this topic and how that progressed. I'm going to talk you through the methodology for this thematic, and then I'm going to hand over to the two lead inspectors who led the work on this thematic. First of all, Avtar Singh, who's going to talk us through some of the findings in relation to minority ethnic staff, and then Trevor Worsfield, who will be focusing on service delivery and quality of service delivery to people on probation. You're then going to be hearing from Alex Bergeraz from the organisation User Voice, who have been our partners on this thematic, and he's going to say a little bit about the views of people on probation that his organisation spoke to. And then finally, you'll be hearing from Helen Amor, who is our Head of Effective Practice, talking a bit about some of the effective practice principles and examples of effective practice that we found during the fieldwork for this inspection. So lots of interesting inputs, and I hope you enjoy the presentations that will follow. Next slide, please, Holly. This is a follow-up inspection 2 years on from an initial inspection on race equality in probation, which we published in March 2021, based on fieldwork we undertook at the end of 2020. That was while the probation was still split into CRCs and the MPS, and we visited 5 local delivery units around the country to look both at the quality of services being delivered to minority ethnic people on probation, but also talking to staff, minority ethnic staff in probation, about their views and experiences. That was the first thematic that we'd done on this topic since 2004. So it was a chance to look at how things had progressed or hadn't progressed even since that date. At that point, we looked at 100 different individual cases, both MPS and CRC legacy cases. We surveyed minority ethnic staff in the areas we visited. We spoke to service leaders as well, and we made 15 recommendations where we felt that urgent action was needed, and you'll hear later this morning about whether progress has been made against those recommendations. The findings from that first thematic were disappointing. In relation to service delivery, we found little evidence that probation staff had spoken to minority ethnic people on probation about their ethnicity, their culture, their religion, or their experience of discrimination. We found few specific services for that group, and in fact the number of services being commissioned to meet the needs of minority ethnic people on probation had actually declined during the TR period, and we felt a need for significant improvement in the engagement that probation practitioners had with minority ethnic people on probation. In relation to the staff that we surveyed and spoke to, many of them told us that they lacked confidence in the willingness of their managers to respond to some of the concerns that they had. They didn't view arrangements for promotion or recruitment as necessarily fair or transparent. They felt grievance procedures needed to be reviewed, and there was evidence that minority ethnic people, staff, were underrepresented in the more senior management grades in probation. So some quite serious concerns which we felt needed to be urgently addressed. And such was the level of those concerns that I said that we needed to come back in 2 years and report on whether progress had been made. And that is the report that you'll be hearing about that we launched yesterday. Next slide. Final slide for me. So just a little word about the methodology we used for this most recent thematic, which in many ways replicated our methodology from the previous thematic, because we were keen to see whether progress had been made on the methodology. We once again visited 5 local probation delivery units. 2 of those were units we also visited first time round, so Bedfordshire and Bradford and Calderdale we visited 2 years ago, but we wanted to look at some other areas as well. So Nottingham, Southwark and Walsall and Wolverhampton were added to the schedule. The fieldwork was conducted in February and March of this year, and we inspected 50 individual cases of minority ethnic people on probation, and in the course of those case inspections we're able to interview 44 probation officers or PSOs who'd supervised those cases. We were interested in finding effective good practice and so asked that those cases did include examples of good practice if possible. As well as that case data from that sample of 50, we were also able to analyse a much bigger sample of cases which we collected as we went around the country on our usual local probation inspections, as a sample of over 1,500 cases, and that gives us a pretty robust way to look at whether minority ethnic people on probation are receiving a better or worse service than their white counterparts. The other key aspect of this thematic was also to go back and look at the views of staff and whether their views had improved over the last 2 years, and we issued a survey to all minority ethnic staff in the 5 areas that we visited, and 97 people responded, which we think is about half of the staff in those areas. 25 of those asked for a follow-up interview, and so we were able to talk to them about their concerns. As with all of our inspections now, we're very keen to hear the views of people on probation, and User Voice were able to hear to do that for us, and you'll hear from Alex about those views in a minute. We held a range of staff focus groups and interviews, and we also spoke with 16 senior leaders at a national level who've been responsible for responding to our recommendations on this agenda, and that included people leading the Race Action Programme and the Probation Workforce Programme, and we spoke to the Chief Probation Officer as well. So huge range of evidence to draw on as Trevor and Avatar reach their conclusions, and you'll be hearing more about that now. Avatar, I think I'm handing over to you.
Thank you very much, Justin. If we can have the next slide, that would be really, really helpful. So I'm going to speak very briefly about some work that we did, which was around speaking directly to Black minority ethnic staff, but also reviewing feedback that we had received as a result of a questionnaire. As Justin said, there were just under 100 people who completed that questionnaire, but we did have 25 one-to-one interviews. The vast majority of them were in person, but there were some that were held remotely. The title of this particular kind of report is, a work in progress, and I think that that's probably the best place to house the evidence that we received. Just to say that, overall, in terms of culture and inclusivity, it was really encouraging to see that 3/4 of the people did believe that there was an inclusive culture in probation, and that over the last 2 years, certainly since the tragic death of George Floyd, there were some offices where there was more inclusivity. However, what we found was that a positive culture and inclusivity was not evidenced in A, all the offices that we went to, and B, the feedback from people. So, for example, disappointingly, one member of staff said, "I see white senior managers coming into the office now and again. They don't talk to me and tend to gravitate towards white staff." And then another comment, "The culture here is terrible. People rarely mix, and there are teams within teams." And the latter is a finding that we did hear about repeatedly, where we were told that there were pockets of staff within teams, and that kind of mixing and that inclusivity wasn't always there. But like I said, on a positive note, more staff since the last survey reporting that there is more inclusivity. However, others commenting on how much more work that needs to be done. Next, please, Holly. The next slide is around the understanding and support from managers. One of the things that we did find here was that as far as support was concerned, there was a direct correlation between the ethnicity of managers and the ethnicity of the staff. And where the ethnicity was shared, staff were able to more confidently speak with their line managers about issues that were perhaps troubling them or issues that were sensitive. However, where there wasn't that kind of shared identity, there were some real concerns where minority ethnic staff reported that they felt that their managers didn't understand the cultures from which they were raised in. And one person said, Black people, Asian people, and those from mixed heritage backgrounds have different needs. They're all clumped together. One of the things that the inspector did find within the review of mixed heritage boys within the youth justice sector was that mixed heritage is very different to other ethnicities and other groups. But what was happening was that there was a very limited appreciation and understanding of the different kind of cultural background, ethnicity, heritage that people were from, and really there was much more work needed to understand that better. One of the things that we'd mentioned last time, and we were provided with some very disturbing examples of cases where minority ethnic staff had been allocated cases of people on probation who had committed a racially motivated crime, and there was no conversation with the member of staff, and these cases were allocated and triggering considerable trauma. I'll just refer you to our initial report, where you will see several examples of staff who had been allocated cases and had led them, to experience considerable trauma. And we were very disappointed to find that the issue remains. One member of staff said, if I had to go back to a manager to say that I can't have a case, it would concern me that I'd be judged as being incompetent. And that is not really acceptable. It is nothing to do with competency. It is actually to do with appropriateness. It's about honouring people. It's about showing sensitivity. So once again, as far as the allocation of cases is concerned, and support from managers with these types of cases, there is more work that needs to be done. Holly, next, please. Okay. Now, in terms of the next slide with regard to fairness, development and progression, this time we found some encouraging signs in relation to progression for staff going into senior probation officer or business manager roles. There was still significant gaps in some PDUs with regard to staff progressing from senior probation officer roles to perhaps regional director roles, but we did see some encouraging signs in some PDUs where Black, Asian, minority, ethnic staff had been given opportunities to develop, and we were very pleased to find that. And with regard to that progression, we came across a number of examples where the opportunities for taking on temporary roles, temporary promotion into the SPO role was there, and we came across many Black and Asian members of staff who had accepted that role. But disappointingly, what we found was that many of them didn't actually go on to be successful to achieve the permanent role. And disappointingly, what also happened was that even though they hadn't achieved success to get a permanent role, they were still supporting and helping white managers who had been promoted into that role for months about the role of the senior probation officer. So there was something that just didn't seem to fit right. So yes, there were opportunities for promotion. However, turning those into permanent roles did not always happen, and many of these members of staff were then having to almost mentor and coach white senior probation officers. And one said, as non-white staff, we must constantly prove ourselves. If we make a mistake, it is twice as bad compared to a white person making it. This was something that we found 2 years ago, and we're finding it again because we were really, really keen in this inspection to ensure that we didn't go too far into history, but we looked at the currency, how things were. And again, and regrettably, it was painful to hear the stories of Black, Asian, minority, ethnic people giving us these examples. And as the bottom comment says there, whilst the promotion opportunities have improved, there is still underrepresentation in assistant chief officer grades. Holly, final slide from me, please. A challenge that we came across in our initial review of race equality in probation was about the confidence and safety that Black, minority, ethnic staff felt about raising grievances and complaints. And whilst we found at an empirical level that there was no kind of significant difference in grievances being upheld between white staff and minority ethnic staff. We did, however, still find very concerning reports of what minority ethnic staff believed were injustices in terms of how the complaints and grievances were handled. In our most current report, you will have seen an example of a white member of staff eating a bacon sandwich in front of a Muslim member of staff, and the white member of staff saying how lovely it was, and would he want to try that? And the black member of staff, who was a Muslim, was highly offended and took the matter to a manager to raise that. However, the response came back that the member of staff was just having a laugh. Well, that's not acceptable. That is not honouring other faiths. It is not upholding the value that each of us has in our various identities, which have been informed by our walks of life, and that made this particular member of staff have even less confidence in whether their complaint would be heard. So while there has been some work done in reviewing these documents in terms of the impact for many people, they still do not feel safe. And when you have a statistic which says just under a half do not feel safe, that is not good. And one of the things that I recently heard on another presentation was somebody was talking about how these things hurt, and I think that we have to hold on to that. That when people, experience these biases, these prejudices, these hurt, and they raise trauma. And it's not acceptable, and it needs to be dealt. It needs to be dealt fairly, in a timely way, so that people feel safe in their workplace. And sadly, one person said, "I feel betrayed. I've given so much of my working life to probation, and they have shown I don't matter to them. I have now logged off." This is somebody who has just made a conscious decision that there is just no point, and that's not a way to live or to work. So in summary, in terms of the 25 individuals that we spoke to and the 95 surveys that we reviewed, and from the findings of the focus groups, both with managers and operational staff, the conclusion is that there continue to be current, recent examples of harm that people are experiencing, and that in the first review, while there were many examples of historical incidents, now we are still seeing current incidents. So it is work in progress. There is a challenge for us all to make things better. Thank you, Holly. Trevor.
So I'm going to talk about issues in relation to service delivery. So firstly, looking at leadership, strategy and resources. In this inspection, we wanted to see what progress has been made since our previous inspection report in 2021 and judge how far the recommendations have been implemented. We found that senior leaders have been concerned to understand the issues that minority ethnic staff face. They conducted a wide-ranging survey in conjunction with RISE and the trade unions, and have initiated a series of actions to address these concerns. For example, the Race Action Programme launched a series of initiatives, including an inclusion learning hub and recruitment of race allies. However, For some of these initiatives, further work is needed to employ these initiatives locally. So, for example, although a large number of race allies have been recruited and trained, there is no mechanism for local leaders to know who they are and to include them in work to support minority ethnic staff. We met with all the 5 regional probation directors in the regions and heard about their public commitments they have made to address issues of race equality. However, we did find that these were not always recalled by frontline staff. There were issues in terms of how those messages reach frontline staff. One of our key recommendations in the previous inspection was about the need to have a centrally driven strategy for race equality in service delivery, and we were disappointed that this has not been produced. The focus has been more on addressing the concerns of minority ethnic staff, which is good, but rather than setting out clear expectations about how delivery to minority ethnic people on probation is to be improved. It is therefore perhaps not surprising to learn that there was little discernible improvement in delivery in the cases inspected since the previous inspection. However, in situations where local leaders are communicating initiatives and then modelling behaviours and expectations with frontline staff, we did see better engagement with staff on issues of race equality, which is a necessary precursor to improving service delivery. So moving on to our next slide, which is on staff recruitment, development, training and engagement. Probation staffing is becoming more representative of the race and ethnicity of the communities served, and initiatives are in place to improve local recruitment. However, it's concerning that minority ethnic applicants do worse in the recruitment process than white applicants, making up about 27% of applicants, but only 17% of those receiving formal job offers. The reasons for this require investigation. As Aptar said, while the proportion of middle managers who are from minority ethnic communities has increased, there is still underrepresentation at assistant chief officer level. We had hoped to see more training and development programs for probation practitioners on anti-racist practice, addressing discrimination, and providing a culturally appropriate service. However, there have been no new national initiatives since the last inspection. There have been some initiatives, some local initiatives, such as in Yorkshire and the Humber, where they've delivered programs such as Show Racism the Red Card and Improving Cultural Confidence, which should support improvements in delivery to minority ethnic people on probation. We are also beginning to see the rollout of new training programs for managers on producing a more inclusive workplace culture and interactive scenarios-based learning on addressing issues of discrimination in staffing matters. These have entailed considerable investment and show some promise. We would hope that such training will enable leaders to manage issues of race equality more effectively. We found that nationally, minority ethnic staff score lower than white staff on all measures of satisfaction in the civil service staff survey, especially in relation to measures of discrimination and bullying and harassment. Further work, therefore, is required nationally and locally to understand why there's less satisfaction and put in place actions to address these disparities. So moving on to our next slide, which is about services for minority ethnic people on probation. There had been a reduction in services specifically tailored to the needs of people from minority ethnic communities since our last inspection, and they were only evidenced in West Yorkshire when we inspected. The commissioning of these services has been delayed because of a budget review, and the expected increase in the Regional Outcome Innovation Fund for 2023 has not happened, with the likelihood that some gaps in provision for these groups will remain. We found that practitioners' knowledge of relevant services in local minority ethnic communities was limited and patchy, meaning that where out in the community there were tailored services that would meet individual offending related need, these were not being accessed consistently. Some areas were attempting to systematise such knowledge. For example, in Nottingham, there are plans to employ former people on probation with lived experience as community engagement officers to identify and introduce minority ethnic people on probation to relevant sources of help that would address factors linked to their offending. As this inspection was conducted on site, we had the opportunity to view the spaces and the places into which people on probation arrived, the waiting areas, etc. We noted that many were bare and lacking in positive images of minority ethnic people. We felt this was a missed opportunity to set the tone of welcome, inclusion and aspiration for people from different communities. It said something about the culture of the offices and is something that would be easy for local managers to rectify. We commented previously on the need to improve the quality and engagement of minority ethnic people in their PSR assessments. The PSR pilot courts have not specifically targeted PSRs on minority ethnic individuals, although the senior presiding judge has subsequently agreed that they should be a priority cohort for PSRs. However, these pilots have achieved a higher completion rate of reports for this group, and practitioners in these pilot areas have received training on recognising and addressing racial disparity. The hope now is that learning will be shared more widely, along with the lessons learning about improving the quality and take-up of PSRs for minority ethnic people. More analysis will then need to follow to ascertain whether improved take-up, which is very variable across the country, and the quality of the PSRs on minority ethnic people leads to improvements in sentencing. So our next slide is about the use of research and information. One of our previous recommendations was to research the potential impact of matching practitioners with people on probation in line with their race and ethnicity. Research was completed by Dr. Patrick Williams and Dr. Catherine Graham that concluded a shared understanding of racism, discrimination and identity between probation practitioner and the person they are supervising seems central to improving the experience and potential outcomes of probation for people from minority ethnic communities. However, no work has yet occurred on looking at the policy and practice implications of this finding. We were pleased to see that national data on service delivery outcomes, segmented by ethnicity, is now published annually by HMPPS in the Offender Equalities Report. Similarly, data on staff and human resource processes also segmented by ethnicity and are made available in the annual Staff Equalities Report. This data is critical for identifying and questioning disproportionate outcomes. At a local level, the Probation Equality Monitoring Tool is available to monitor disproportionality in outcomes by ethnicity for people on probation. This tool was due to be refined and relaunched shortly after the inspection took place. However, at the time of the inspection, the information it provides was not consistently understood or used, and practitioners had little knowledge of it or what it showed, and were therefore unaware of where changes were required to reduce disproportionate outcomes. While there is now more data available on disproportionality, one manager commented, "Everybody is good at giving you stats, but commentary is lacking. I want to know what these stats mean." More work is needed to translate the available data into information for action. So then moving on to the learning on the next slide on the quality of case supervision about the 50 cases we reviewed. We used the ASPIRE framework to consider the quality of assessment, planning and implementation and delivery of interventions. We had asked probation delivery units to identify cases which were considered to be examples of effective practice, and we prioritised those in selecting cases for inspection. We also drew on data from the first 32 of the 36 inspections we've carried out in our local probation inspection programme, which comprised 1,547 cases, of which 394 were of minority ethnic individuals. We judged that assessments sufficiently analysed individual diversity in just 16% of cases, and that assessments sufficiently considered the impact of diversity on ability to engage people in their supervision in just 26% of those 50 cases. This has improved little since the previous inspection. We found once again there was a reluctance for staff to ask about individuals' experience of discrimination, and a gap in professional curiosity, which was often lacking, including in relation to exploring such protective factors as faith and family. As a consequence, planning took sufficient account of diversity in only 28% of cases, which meant that plans often failed to provide a sound basis for forming a trusting and meaningful relationship with individuals. However, despite this, we did find there was sufficient focus on maintaining an effective relationship in 64% of cases, although fewer interventions were delivered to minority ethnic individuals than white people. Comparing the quality of work with minority ethnic people with that of white people from our larger sample, we find that the quality of assessment, planning, delivery, and review was statistically worse for minority ethnic people against all of our key questions in our inspection in relation to engagement and work to reduce reoffending. In relation to work to address risk of harm, however, the quality of work was similar. You can see the comparisons of work against some of these key questions in this table, particularly as they relate to engagement in assessment and planning, the engagement in delivery, and in reviewing the person's desistance. This is a very significant finding which demonstrates the pressing need to improve the quality of work with minority ethnic individuals. We now know from our recent research that better quality work leads to more sentence completions and a greater likelihood of reducing reoffending. So turning to our next slide, which is on progress with previous recommendations. Throughout our report, we make judgments as to the extent to which we consider previous recommendations have been met. We judge that sufficient progress had been made where the work done to address the recommendations had moved sufficiently from the inspection in 2021. We judge that some progress had been met where the work done in relation to the previous inspection has moved things forward, and no progress when the situation remains the same or has worsened. We judge that one recommendation on the publication of outcome data has been sufficiently met. We judged there have been some progress against 9 recommendations. These relate to the recruitment of a more representative staff group, the progression of minority ethnic staff into management grades, the production of development plans for all staff, and the training of managers in managing diversity. There has also been some progress in relation to researching the potential for matching staff and people on probation by ethnicity, commissioning services for minority ethnic group, and improving the quality of PSRs on minority ethnic people in the PSR pilot courts. There's also been some progress in engagement with minority ethnic staff and consulting minority ethnic people on probation. So those areas where there's some progress, but not as much as we would have liked to have seen. We judged there have been no progress in relation to 5 recommendations, 4 of which we have repeated and 1 of which we have repeated in an amended form. So now turning to this in the next slide, which is the summary of our recommendations. In relation to the repeated recommendations, we continue to recommend a national strategy and clear expectations for work with minority ethnic people on probation to improve service delivery for this group of people so that it is as good as for white people. We recommend the provision of learning programs for practitioners to improve their confidence and ability at addressing issues of racial discrimination and providing culturally appropriate services for people on probation. We again recommend the provision of material for working with those recommended of racially motivated offences and a clear policy commitment that minority ethnic practitioners are consulted about whether they take on a particular case, and if so, how they were supported in undertaking such work. We recommend that HMPPS should review formal and informal complaint and grievance procedures in consultation with minority ethnic staff and make improvements to improve perceived fairness. We then made 1 amended and 3 new recommendations. The amended recommendation is that HMPPS should improve the quality of assessment and planning for minority ethnic people on probation, including incorporating guidance in new assessment and planning tools as they're developed about how to address issues of culture, faith, and experience of discrimination. We recommend that HMPPS should improve engagement with minority ethnic staff and seek to achieve parity of satisfaction with white staff. And then 2 recommendations for regional probation directors. Firstly, to ensure that minority ethnic people have access to appropriate services and interventions while on probation and in services in the wider community, and to provide a welcoming environment in probation premises that celebrates diversity. So that's our recommendation. So I'm now pleased to hand over to Alex from User Voice, who will talk about their findings from their interviews with minority ethnic people on probation. Alex.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Trevor. So my name's Alexander Bergeras. So I'm a lived experience consultant, as well as I was the lead peer researcher for this thematic for User Voice. Our approach, so we conducted remote as well as in-person semi-structured interviews with people on probation from a minority ethnic background. So in total, we spoke to 82 people, and this was broken down into 6 key areas. So we spoke to them about their pre-sentence, their induction, their staff relationships, appointments, access to services, and being heard. So today we're going to run through 3 key themes that emerge from these interviews. And our objective of this consultation was to better understand how an individual's race and ethnicity affects their probation experience. Furthermore, we wanted to understand how their experience on probation and what support they have or haven't received, both in general and in relation to their race and ethnicity. So we also wanted to understand how people on probation's experience of probation in relation to their race and ethnicity has changed since the previous inspection of 2021. Additionally, we wanted to collate people on probation's views on what probation needs to do better to help those from a minority ethnic background, and of course highlight any good practices that could be built upon by the service. If I could have the next slide, please. So 7 in 10 people believe that their race and ethnicity are not a factor that affects their probation experience. However, for us, we've seen that there is still some very clear experiences of discrimination. For those that perhaps didn't, we saw an example where someone said, "Not at all, I don't feel like I was being outcasted or treated differently, to be fair." However, some people on probation from a minority ethnic background have experienced clear discrimination and what they describe as a subconscious racial bias. So we heard someone say, "Yes, as a Muslim, I feel I'm prejudged and assumptions are made based on my religion. This has been the case since I started with probation, so no, there's been no changes over the last few years." Someone else said, "Sometimes you get funny looks from them. They would pull faces and show attitude to me. It feels like they have a subconscious bias about me." So participants expressed the need for more religious and cultural awareness across probation. So with User Voice, everything we do is peer-led. So our solutions too are peer-led. And the solution for this, we believe, is to celebrate the cultural heritage of people on probation through campaigns, posters, awareness sessions. We believe this would foster knowledge amongst probation and other people on probation, which would result in those from a minority ethnic background feeling more welcomed and considered. From our research, it's evident that there is a void in the approach to religious beliefs, and quite often it was a no-go area of discussion. So multiple interviewees stated that they were told by their probation practitioners that they are not allowed to speak about religion or their religious beliefs. So a few examples here is someone said, "It's been difficult with probation as my probation officer is not able to talk about religion. I do think that probation should hear our experiences. I think people need to open up. Those working in the criminal justice system need to hear what everyone has experienced." Additionally, someone else said, We didn't have any discussions about my needs, cultural or otherwise. And I do have cultural needs. It would have been nice to talk about it. I was talked to about my family, but no questions on my background. Where I went to school, where I grew up, everything was still kind of segregated. They had Catholic schools, schools for Muslims, and Church of England, etc. But being mixed race, they were never sure where to put me. All my life, to Black and Asian people, I was white, but to white people, I was Asian. I never really fit in anywhere. I used to pretend to be Portuguese or Spanish so I wouldn't get jumped in the streets, which was quite moving as well. So we look at some effective practice, though, from this, and the case study ZS. So ZS got to know his probation practitioner well before his release. So he goes on to say, I've consistently been on probation, so I know all of it already. It's more the workers that make a difference in the system. I went through all of this with my current probation officer before I was released, and it really helped. It helped us get to know each other. It's the first time I've been able to openly speak with probation. I just speak to him like I would speak to anybody else. I don't think of him as a probation officer. All my life, social services have been in control of things, whereas I'm free to make my own choices with the guidance of probation now. So looking at the peer-led solution here, we think probation practitioners need to take the time during the inductions to speak to an individual about their religious beliefs and their cultural heritage. However, this cannot be done in a tick box style. So such topics need to be discussed during an open conversation where the practitioner gets to better understand the needs of the individual and simply get to know the person better. I can have the next slide, please. So from our research and from our findings, diversity in probation staff at all levels is key to fostering understanding and creating inclusivity and relatability. So in cases where the office is more diverse, it seems like people have more understanding. The diversity of an office seems to have a significant impact on everyone's knowledge from within that office as well. So we heard an example from someone saying, I definitely think diversity is important. In this day and age, people need to be more aware, clued up that everyone is different, where they come from and their background. So many people on probation from a minority ethnic background feel there's a lack of diversity in probation staff, with diversity more likely to be found in the lower paid staff. So someone said, not really diverse, I only see white women. I saw black lady cleaning, but not behind the desk. Diversity is important because in probation services, you get a lot of people from different backgrounds. It would make it more relatable. So despite this, in some regions, we did see that people felt ethnic minorities are well represented across probation staff, with someone saying the office is diverse, it's very important, I'd feel uncomfortable otherwise, and it makes me question why. It makes me feel reassured. So I think it highlights perhaps some inconsistencies across different regions. And our peer-led solution around this is to employ more people from a minority ethnic background, specifically to employ more people from a background into the senior positions. So where this is already the case, it has been noted to foster understanding across the rest of probation. And we think this makes a significant difference. So thank you for your time. We are publishing our report at the end of this month. So if anyone's interested in receiving a copy of that report, I will put a link in where you can submit your details and you'd be able to get the report sent to you directly. But please do not do it until the end of the presentation. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Alex. That presentation and the user voice research leads me nicely into this slide, which focuses on the effective practice principles when working with people from different culture and heritage. So what we've learned from research and in our inspections is that engagement needs to be at the core of the work that we're doing. So Building positive relationships and trust are key components of probation practice. And this is done by understanding the individual's background, their characteristics, their lifestyle, what their enablers and barriers are, and treating a person as an individual. So you mentioned in your slides there, Alex, about that induction and how important that is in terms of getting to know someone, but also carrying that through with the work with people on probation. And Trevor mentioned earlier about the academic insights that's available on the website in terms of that and the role of relationships and engagement resulting in positive outcomes. Being courageous and curious. So asking the questions, finding out about somebody's experience of discrimination and what their diversity is. A practitioner in the East Midlands noted that when they were talking around professional curiosity, that you can't get to know someone unless you ask the questions, which was a really good point. And also in Suffolk, a practitioner commented that it's important to acknowledge the difference. Don't be afraid. Differences exist and it's a good thing, and diversity enriches us all. So I think that's a really good kind of way of thinking and taking something to take away. Asking individuals about their self-identity. So again, this is around really understanding their experiences, what their personal circumstances are, and their individual ethnicity. And also understanding that discrimination is not only a contributing factor to being involved in the criminal justice system, it's also a barrier when trying to move on with their lives. So there's all sorts of considerations in terms of practical and personal considerations. How has employment and accommodation been impacted now they're in the criminal justice system? Relationships with families and communities, how have they been impacted? But also how a person's identity may have changed. You know, becoming involved in the criminal justice system, how do they reclaim that identity, or how do they manage a new identity and move forward, and what support might they need in doing that? Interventions being tailored to the needs of individuals. So this goes back to, you know, what we've talked about throughout the presentation in terms of the engagement and relationships principles and ensuring that it's an individualised and tailored approach. And then the final one there is about taking opportunities to reflect on your own practice. So this is so important, isn't it? There's so many opportunities, there's supervision, there's teams, there's colleagues and celebration events where you can really try to understand yourself and how you relate to others. From a strategic perspective, leaders might want to reflect on climate assessments in relation how they can improve areas of inclusion in their regions. But also practitioners just considering how they can improve their understanding and knowledge around culture and religion and heritage of the people that they supervise on probation. But also considering how reflection can be built in and embedded into everyday practice. So in the next slides, I'm going to show you some examples of effective practice that we saw within the inspection, and that'll bring some of these principles to life. So spotlight on Suffolk. So in terms of that kind of opportunities to reflect and promoting opportunities within the teams, we saw a great example of where the team was using the diversity calendar to organise celebratory lunches. And one example was in Black History Month, the team brought in food for African and Caribbean culture to share. And food's a really good hook, isn't it, to get people together, engaging and discussing and having conversations. And I think there's also something there about somebody being willing to share food from their culture and how they then see the value and the importance in the relationships that they've got within their team and how that brings everyone together. But what also was really interesting in this team was a creative member of staff took photographs of individuals and then interviewed them through the lens of their ethnicity and their experiences, and also how that influenced them at work. And he created biographies that were displayed in the staffing areas, which really brought a feeling of kind of getting to know each other and promoting togetherness, which was a really good example. We also saw a really clear vision and strategy to drive inclusion from the head of service, which was understood by all of the PDU, which suggested really good communication. So the delivery plan was collaboratively developed following a business day, and all staff were engaged in that, and clear expectations around delivery areas linked to diversity were set out. So these included, you know, equality, diversity, inclusion and belonging. People as an area, which included what you would expect in terms of R&R and supervision and wellbeing champions, but there was also an opportunity to have one-to-one surgeries with the head of service. Learning and development was also an area which again, you would expect included training, mandatory training and local authority training packages, but also had a mentoring scheme within the plan there, as we've mentioned, maybe in terms of staff who were seeking promotion. And I think also what was really evident was around the consistency of the approach in the PDU. So you can see from the quote there from the head, Chantel Foster believed that she really had a real responsibility to weave equality, diversity, inclusion and belonging into everything they did in the PDU. And one of the examples of that is that all PDU meetings and management meetings now start with a 10 to 15 minute dedicated slot to diversity and inclusion, which really gives this area priority. And, we talk about inclusion moments, so it gives staff an opportunity to kind of reflect and have those discussions. We also seen in Suffolk that they recognise the disproportionate number of minority ethnic young people in secure estate and how they would be transitioning into the adult arena. And they've got a multidisciplinary group managed by the Community Safety Partnerships, which has a whole host of representatives. And it was established to analyse the drivers behind that, tackle the root causes, but also address systemic discrimination. So you can see in the quote there was one example where a young man had been stopped and searched a significant number of times in a short period of time. But the same day, there'd been other cases where there was active intelligence, but that they hadn't been stopped. And within the multi-agency arena, this was really challenged, and the rationale that was looked at, and also awareness raised in terms of issues around disproportionality. The team also advocate for young people, and they provide packages of support for individuals and their families, and including their younger siblings. So that includes safety planning to exit negative lifestyles. There is counselling and trauma support, but also emergency rehousing and relocation for higher risk cases. So this work draws heavily on concepts of contextual and transitional safeguarding. And again, there are academic insights on the HMI probation website which explore this in more detail. Next slide, please. So in London, we've seen an equality, diversity and belonging team. So this was a really dedicated team that reflected on people survey results and consulted with staff about issues around inclusion and drew suggestions from staff to develop a business plan. So they piloted this in 3 PDUs, and what you can really see here is the full cycle of this approach. So there was the engagement, the assessment, the action planning, there's been the implementation, and then the reviewing. So the region can really look to see if they are achieving the desired results within their equality, diversity, inclusion and belonging policy. And they're using the civil service people survey to do that measurement. And then there was the example of the Muslim Women in Prison project. So this is a tailored service which is community-led, culturally and faith-informed, and it's a resettlement programme. So primarily supports women from HMP Newhall and Askham Grange, and it doesn't just deliver those first line services that you would expect around, E to E and accommodation, but it also addresses the kind of push and pull factors which women in Muslim communities experience. So things like dishonouring family and community by being incarcerated, difficulties reconnecting with children, other patriarchal structures that exist in Muslim communities, and that fragility of honour and difficulties in returning to communities and feeling of shame. And they note their successes as visibility and understanding, and that the practitioners have a real innate understanding of the issues Muslim women face. They have a clear identity. The service values are defined by faith and gender equality. It's a grassroots model, so it's accessible and it's trustworthy. And then the final thing is around a layer of protection and a sense of collectivism. So they talk about how their faith acts as a refuge for the people that access the service. So we do intend to produce a guide which will provide more detail in relation to these examples of effective practice, and that'll be available in due course. But thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Helen. I think that's the end of the presentations. Many thanks to Helen and to Alex and to Avatar and Trevor for their, not just for their presentations, but all the hard work that they put into the fieldwork and the drafting of this report.